Hey my friends, I hope you'll enjoy this journey to a beautiful area kind of near where I live. Check it out. This little guy is called Usnea Barbata is the Latin name. And this is used, according to the Doctrine of Signatures, as a antimicrobial, antibacterial for the lungs. So it's good for throat infections. And the Doctrine of Signatures is a technique used by earlier herbalists before the advent of chemistry to figure out what plants were good for. So they'd look at it and it'd have a particular sign that were related to an organ or a body part. And this one looks like the cilia of the lungs, so they figured that it must be good for the lungs. And it turned out most of the time, whatever signature those plants had, it actually was useful for that. So, and they typically tend to fall around this time of year before the spring growth cycle. So we'll probably see more of these on our way. Now, even in the winter, there are plenty of things that you can pick and mostly make into teas. There are some edibles that are available around this time of year, but most of it is a tea or medicine-based picking. All of these trees are tsugai, or the eastern white hemlock. And you can tell these from yews. Yews have much longer leaves, and these have these sort of silver stripe underneath it. Yews are a little more square or sometimes triangle shaped, and these are very flat. And I've always looked for that little white gray stripe underneath. And then the smell too, it has a typical pine smell. The yew tree is very, very poisonous, especially when concentrated. I was actually at an herbal conference one time, and the person leading the edible plant walk was asked what this sort of urban plant was. And thinking that it was a hemlock, this girl bit into it. And I was like, oh, that's a yew, that is not a hemlock. Because hemlocks don't typically grow in a city, unless they have a little park area. So, not too hard to differentiate, but I guess if you're not familiar with it, then you would have a hard time with that. This is another hemlock. Something called the woolly adelgid, and I don't think this is suffering from it, but we're going to lose potentially a lot of the hemlocks that we have around here because of this growth. These ones seem to be okay, which is good. This forest has a lot of maple trees, a lot of hemlocks, and quite a bit of Shagbark Hickory. And Shagbark Hickory have delicious nuts that are kind of like a pecan, but a little bit sweeter tasting. But it's hard to get to them before the animals get to them. Anything in the pine family. Any of the needles can be made into a tea. So the eastern white pine, Pinus strobilus, the hemlock and tsugai, both of those, the pitch pine can be made into a tea. And I would recommend, if you do wish to try it, obviously you do so at your own risk, if you do choose to make tea out of it, I recommend either freezing the needles for about 20 minutes, half an hour, or drying them first, because you can steep them right away in hot water. But two things happen. The cell walls have not been cracked on the pines, so it doesn't release the vitamin C and the flavor very well if you just put it in fresh. And also, if you dry it out, you could make it into a powder using the rinds of a lemon or an orange. And these bioflavonoids in the lemon or orange rind, coupled with the powdered hemlock or other pines, give you a complete vitamin C that is really bioavailable. A lot of the vitamin C's that you buy, even the emergency, the reason why they give you 5,000% of your daily consumption level is that your body can absorb it. So by combining the form of vitamin C in the pines with bioflavonols, you make it more bioavailable. So it's a good tip if you're into making sort of green smoothies or green powders. This plant is called Silastris, or bittersweet. And there's another member of this family that's used in India as a brain tonic. And bittersweet's used as a decorative item around here, but it's more of a nuisance plant to most people. And it's a cardiac glycosoid, so it causes irregular heartbeat. So not something you want to nibble on. But it tends to grow and strangle trees that it's growing around, like on this one. So, not a super friendly plant for some. There's some rose hips. It's a wild rose. Rose hips are good all year long. They last typically all the way until spring. Surprisingly, cranberries actually last usually until late April, until they start to flower again. And cranberries are far more prevalent than people think they are. There's enough near where I live to feed multiple towns, 100 Christmas or Thanksgiving dinners. So once you find a cranberry patch, it doesn't have to be in a boggy area. They just like sandy soil that's sometimes moist. It doesn't need to be a swamp or anything like that. There's some more hemlocks. When hemlocks are young, and I'll show this probably in the spring, hemlocks can have their little tips pinched off. They're not growing yet, but there'll be a nice green tip. You can pop those off and eat them. And they kind of have a lemony, piney, tangy flavor. They're super, super delicious. Highly recommended. This beast is a grapevine. I'd say half of our grapes here are escaped domesticated grapes. Half are wild grapes. But they grow on these massive vines. Usually you cannot reach the grapes when they're on a vine that large. But sometimes you can find them on the ground once they're fully ripe. Some brown birch. If I find a smaller one, I'll show you. On brown birch, unlike white birch, there's salicylic acid in it. Actually, there's a huge, I don't know if you can see it with this camera, but that's a massive grapevine there. On brown birch, as well as wintergreens, there's something called salicylic acid, and this breaks down in your body in a similar way to aspirin or Tylenol. So it's used as a pain reliever. It can cause liver damage. I know people that have made sort of a drink from it and fermented it and really concentrated it. But it's really the wintergreen essential oil that's toxic to our livers. But but small quantities are fine. You can chew on wintergreen or chew on branches without any issue. Here's another beautiful grapevine. And you can usually tell them because they're very shaggy, especially the ones around here. And these grapes will produce probably red to purple clusters. We do have some green ones, but I don't very frequently see green grapes around here. Haha, this is Shagbark Hickory. So this is a Shagbark Hickory. Pretty easy to tell just because of the shaggy bark. Maples sometimes have this bark shape as well, but these usually have big plates coming off of them, especially in the winter when there's new growth about to happen. This particular area is filled with shagbark hickories, so kind of a unique spot for this part of Massachusetts. Fallen any ice here. This is a better example of a shagbark. Pretty easily identified plant, or tree I should say. And this produces nuts, like I said, very similar to pecans. They have a really good taste, and they're good raw or dried out. I highly recommend them if you can find them before the animals eat them all. I had someone ask me online how I got into foraging and wildcrafting, and my journey began probably 12 years ago. I started to think about why we weren't making use of all of the trees and plants and leafy beings that grew around me. And I figured at one point in our history we were making use of probably all of it, just because we had limited resources. So that thought process led me to do a lot of research, to talk to a lot of people, study with a lot of people. But most of my research was self-directed, so I wasn't really studying with one particular person. I studied as an herbalist with Demetria Clark. She was from Princeton, Massachusetts, but she lives out in North Carolina now. But I think understanding of plants and herbalism is something innate to human beings, so it doesn't take a special person to be able to engage with it. I think everybody has the capacity to do it because it's built into our genetics as creatures. But I think obviously some people have a sort of a predilection and an ability when it comes to it. And for me, with pattern recognition, I'm very good at learning what a plant looks like and then being able to identify it. And I teach wild edible courses, I teach herbal courses. It's all tied together, but the most important part of that whole process is learning to get over the myth of the poisonous plant. There's this myth in our culture that every plant wants to kill us, and that's not true. There's also a myth that you need to be an expert in order to engage with plants. If you start with simple things, start with dandelion or wild lettuce or even pine trees, anything that gets some wild food into your diet in a safe way, that's going to enrich you and inspire you to continue on in that journey. And there's so much to learn. I've been studying it for 12 years, like I said, but I'll be doing it for the rest of my life. But it's a fun process, and I'm excited to share it with other people, because I think it's our birthright as human beings. We're supposed to know the names of things, Even if human beings gave the name, we're supposed to be able to identify them and know their use. But only in the last 100 years have we been able to have the luxury of buying all of our food in grocery stores. That's a very new phenomenon. I think at some point, if our society changes at all, we're going to have to look backwards. And it's not a negative step backwards, but we're going to have to reconsider how we live. And thankfully, despite all of our destruction, there's a plethora of resources around us. Some beech tree up here. Some mountain laurels over here. Winter plant ID is a little bit different. In the spring, obviously, it's much easier to identify plants. But once you've been at it for a while, it's pretty easy. Beeches are called Fagus grandifolia in Latin. And usually beech trees have very muscular trunks. And they obviously produce beech nuts, which are edible. Some say toxic in high quantities, but I've never had a problem eating them. You probably won't see any today because of the snow, but Wintergreen is available all winter long. Partridge berry. Wintergreen is Gaultheria procumbens, and Partridge berry is Mitchella repens. And there's something called Ephigia repens, which is in the same family as Partridge berry. And it has these really tiny double flowers, and they taste almost like a sweet perfume. They're really, really tasty. So I recommend checking those out. Gaultheria procumbens, which is wintergreen, and Ephigia repens, which is the sort of double-flowered